Right.
Hello and welcome to the vodcast today, where we're going to discuss Dr. Peter Tickner's book, How to Be a Successful Frauditor. I think one of the most important books in recent years, providing a practical approach to dealing with fraud. Now, before we start discussing it, perhaps Peter could just introduce himself and tell us a bit about his background.
Right. Well, I'm Peter Tickner, and I spent some 40 years as a practitioner. I started off as an external auditor in the health service. I then became an internal auditor and was chief internal auditor of two separate government organisations, ending up as the chief auditor of the Met Police. When I retired from that, I took an interest in academics, and thanks to Mark's help, I managed to achieve my doctorate, also in fraud. So I'd always specialised in fraud throughout my working career. And at the point when I was reaching retirement, I felt it was about time to share some of my knowledge with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Peter. So to start off, could you tell us what is the book about? Just give us a brief snapshot before we get into some of the detail.
Right. Well, it's very much a book about what do you do if you find in an organisation you're confronted by a fraud, either internal or contractor fraud or some fraud by some outside agency that you need to deal with. Most people are very ill-equipped to deal with it. And I found over the years that most people in my profession, the auditing profession, were equally ill-equipped. And in fact, many didn't want to know about a fraud and will go out of their way to avoid becoming involved in one. So I found myself by luck or chance constantly bumping into fraud throughout my working career. In fact, I stumbled across my first fraud when I was only 19. And I was fascinated by them right from the off. And I've always had a knack of finding them when others have not looked for them. And I realized over the years that there weren't any younger generation of fraud hunters coming along. And that you reached a point where many line managers, many auditors just didn't know from all their professional standards what they were supposed to do about fraud. They understood that it was something that they weren't responsible for. They understood it was something that needed to be looked into. They knew a lot about prevention of fraud, but very few actually knew how to either find it, investigate it, stop it, deal with it once they found it. And I thought, I know all these things. I'm in a unique position because I worked for the police for 14 years towards the end of my career and worked with the police. I used ex-police officers to work with me and learnt about the police side of it. I was heavily involved in working also with barristers and lawyers, so I learnt about the legal side of it. And of course, I had many years of a practitioner's experience of stumbling across fraud. So I felt I was in a unique position to put those three things together and show other people how you can learn to do this.
Fascinating.
That was really the driving force.
Yes. Now, frauditor is a very interesting name. Could you tell us what's the difference between a frauditor, an auditor, and a fraud investigator? And perhaps where you got the term frauditor from?
Yes, well, that in itself is interesting. Originally, I was very much an auditor who stumbled across fraud. As time went by, when I got the opportunity, I concentrated on fraud. And when I became a chief auditor, I took the opportunity to ensure that I had plenty of time to look for fraud. And somebody jokingly one day said to me, "You're more of a frauditor than an auditor." And I didn't realize at the time, but there was an article, a very short article written by Thomas Leakin, in which he said that auditors should be frauditors. He'd written it in the context of some banking scandals in America, and he got a bit upset that nobody was taking any notice as auditors. I wasn't aware of that, but I quite like the idea of combining fraud and audit together to get frauditor. So from then on, I tended to refer to myself as a frauditor in private anyway, and to my colleagues. And at the time when I moved to the Metropolitan Police, they already had a fraud squad. They already had internal investigation department. And I knew that quite early on, I was going to end up having to do internal investigations as well as audits. We needed to come up with a phrase that was separate from what the police were using for their various activities. So initially, we came up with forensic internal auditing. And that was the phrase I used. I called it the Forensic Internal Audit Department, that part of my business. And I had an ex-detective superintendent who I employed to run for me, who was ex-fraud squad experience. But very quickly, we found forensic internal audit was too much of a mouthful. So we became fraudit by sort of default, if you like. So that was how that role came about. The auditor differs in the sense that an internal auditor is there to review the systems. He's there to recommend improvements. He's there to advise on prevention. It's not his primary function to detect or look for fraud. The fraud investigator, on the other hand, is only there to look for fraud. Some organisations in the public service have their own separate fraud investigation departments, but quite often for most organisations, you would buy that service in from a specialist. Even somebody like me, you would consider to be a specialist in that context. Mm-hmm. But to me, a fraud investigator is somebody who is employed because you have a problem. You've got a fraud, you've got the consequences of a fraud to deal with, you now need a fraud investigator. They're not somebody you employ at the start. You employ your auditor, hopefully, in your organisation because you need somebody to advise you on your controls and improve your system. And somebody like me gives you the best of both worlds because they can do the audit work, but they're very alert to the fraud investigation side, and they're perfectly competent to manage a fraud investigation should one occur. Most people are not. So the book was very much about this is how you can learn to become competent enough to be confident that you can do this yourself, and you don't need to employ an expensive outside specialist to do it. Mm-hmm. And that was the other driving force. Another driving force was working closely with the police all those years. I soon learnt, in actual fact, the police have very little interest in fraud. It's a difficult thing for them to investigate. It takes detectives' time away from things that are much sexier and easier to deal with, and it often involves a large amount of paperwork. The one thing the police do not need is more paperwork. Mm-hmm. So for all those reasons, if you can investigate fraud yourself as an organisation, there are benefits and advantages. And I saw this book as a way of helping people to understand they could do that.
That's interesting. Now, one of the kind of balances for anyone in an organisation dealing with fraud is the kind of balance between prevention and actually going after the fraudsters. Some might argue that prevention should be the focus of any organisation, and that investigations are an indication of failure. What would you say about that?
Well, I would say that in an ideal world, all we would need is preventative measures. But history shows that organised systems, however well controlled, can always be breached. And history shows however good your preventative measures, if somebody genuinely wants to attack you and defraud you, they will find a way to do it. So therefore, however good your prevention measures are, all they are likely ever to do at their best is to reduce the risk. And to a certain extent, modern risk assessment methodologies enable us to find ways of measuring that reduction of risk and hope that we have reduced most of the risks that we're facing. But in my practical experience, there will always be exceptions. And if that exception happens to be a big one, it could bring your organisation down. So therefore, the investigative capability is a valuable resource, not only because it enables you to find out what's going on, but it enables you to do two other things. People are quite often accused of things they didn't do. During the course of an investigation, you can actually clear people who otherwise would have been tainted by the organisation and their careers unnecessarily damaged. At the same token, if you find somebody has been up to something, you can ensure that they're drummed out of the organisation and the organisation benefits from the consequences, not least of which might be financial, both in terms of preventing losses and in recovering money that might otherwise be lost.
Yes. One of the things that you do explore in the book is is not always pursuing a criminal prosecution using alternative measures. Some critics would argue that's letting the fraudsters get away with it. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, no. I pursue fraudsters the nth degree, as one or two people can testify, even years after they think they've got away with it. If I have a sniff of somebody, I will make sure I nail them eventually. But my argument is this. Criminal prosecution is a very difficult process, particularly in fraud. All the evidence, all the statistics show that it is. First of all, to get a case to the state of criminal prosecution where the CPS are prepared to run with it, you have to go for an enormous number of hurdles. Assuming you reach that point, which is some distance down the road, the chances of a successful conviction in court remain extremely low. You might get I mean, less than 10% of all investigations lead to a criminal prosecution. Less than 10%, nearer 3%. And of that 3 or 4%, only a small percentage actually result in successful prosecutions. So if you're going down the criminal route, your chances of having an outcome that's of any value to the organization are relatively low. There are some cases where the criminal route is the answer, and I don't gainsay that. And in fact, I make the point in my book of saying that you do your investigation in a way that if a criminal process has to take over, you have not invalidated that process. However, my primary concern is that, particularly in the public sector, the organizations and the private sector to an extent as well, you're trying to prevent losses, you're trying to prevent money that could otherwise gone in taxes to be spent and used elsewhere. You're trying to prevent the hemorrhaging of funds through fraud from your organization. So yes, that's what you're primarily trying to do. And the investigative arm enables you sometimes to call back some of that money that's gone out there and recover it for the business. You're not primarily there to decide on the moral judgment about whether that person who's committed the fraud should be punished. That, for me, is a criminal sanction matter, and it's a matter for the courts, and it's a matter for social services and so on, as to the individual and their circumstances when they're caught. There's a great problem in criminology generally, I think, that people tend to see things in terms of the imprisoned person and the fraudster's perspective because they've been in prison. My concern as a practitioner was the people we haven't caught, the people that are still out there, and how we stop the damage to the organisation. There's a different perspective.
Okay, interesting. Now, you touched upon my next question, and that's the relevance to the private sector. Obviously, your experience for your career is all public sector. Does your book have any relevance to someone working in the private sector?
Well, yes, it does, because I would argue, first of all, that all large organisations are broadly the same in the functions that they possess and their vulnerability to being attacked. The rules are slightly different in the public sector, and what you can do is slightly different, but the principles of business are the same. And in fact, large portions of the public sector, both the health service when I was there, the government when I was in central government, and the police when I was there, large portions of the business were commercially outsourced or run by separate businesses anyway. So to be a public sector auditor and investigator in those areas, you had to understand commercial business because this was the world you were living in. So those lessons and the concepts and the principles that I outline in the book are as valid in the private sector as they are in the public, though obviously my emphasis and my experience of cases comes from a public sector background.
Interesting. Now, obviously, you've had one of the most interesting parts of your career towards the end at the Metropolitan Police, and investigating fraud within an organisation that includes police officers must be incredibly challenging. Could you talk about some of the special skills that are required in doing that kind of work?
Well, not only is it incredibly challenging, and it was, but also it is a unique environment because you have to apply the rules in a certain way that you might not need to in any other organisation, public or private. So because the primary function of the Metropolitan Police was a police force, you had to bear in mind that was its primary overriding business objective, was to police London. Nothing else really mattered. So everything that you did had to be subsidiary to the overall aim of policing. So therefore, when you're looking at internal fraud by staff or police officers, as it sometimes was, or by contract businesses that are working for the Met, you had the added difficulty that you had to follow the rules of policing for whatever you were dealing with, which meant you couldn't just charge in and nail a police officer because he had certain rights under police regulations that had to be met that other employees didn't have to have met. Equally, if you found a major case going on, you had to report it to the appropriate person in the police immediately. You couldn't hide under, well, we'll come around to that later, or we're not going to bother the police with this, because you were a police organisation. So even if I was going to deal with it myself, I still had to have a negotiation with the police about who was doing what. And in fact, I had to build up trust and confidence with the police over a number of years before I could do that kind of work. It involved a lot of negotiation. And in the early days, they said, well, you're just the auditors, you're nothing to do with this. But then I found an armed robber with a police contract and everything changed after that. It's amazing how when these things happen, they bring it home to people. They also had a very major scandal just before I arrived when the former deputy head of finance, who by that time was in charge of occupational therapy, was still fiddling the financial services that were paying a covert company on policing, because he was the finance man for it. When he moved into occupational therapy, the police asked him to carry on doing it. So he did. And in the last year he was there, he stole an extra £900,000 from the operation. Thanks to the police very kindly allowing him to carry on being responsible for it. But that had sensitized them to the need to have proper audit and controls, and had allowed them to appoint somebody like me who was already very much a frauditor. I'd done something very similar at the Treasury, where I'd caused an undersecretary to find himself in prison, an unheard of thing in the Treasury. And still, to my knowledge, the highest ranked civil servant ever sent to prison by an auditor. So I claim that honour at the moment. Happy to cede it to somebody else if it in time. But I mean, obviously, there was a number of skills I had to learn. One was this negotiating with the police, and they are very hard to negotiate with. The other one was, and the best trick of all, was by employing ex-police officers. Once I had an ex-police officer working with me, they would talk to their colleagues who would say, well, Peter's all right. You know, he's not one of us, but he's like one of us. Yeah. And that broke barriers. And then, of course, because it was the police, I was forced to talk to the lawyers more, both in civil and criminal cases. And that enabled me to build up a skill set of knowing what the lawyers are looking for, how you can balance that against the needs of the organisation, how you can balance that against the policing needs. And I think all those things came together and enabled me to have what I like to think was a reasonably successful career for 14 years. Mm. And that certainly lasted longer than any previous chief auditor had at the organisation.
Now, Peter, that's absolutely fascinating. And your book is full of those types of anecdotes, as well as, you know, how to go about dealing with fraud in this type of organisation. Where can viewers get hold of a copy? And perhaps you could, I know there's a few in the background there, but
I'm slightly closer at hand, happily.
Yeah. So hold it up to the camera and just tell us where people can get hold of this book.
Right. Well, the cheapest place usually to get hold of it is actually from me. And you can do that via my website, because I have an arrangement with the publisher and I buy stocks of my own book and sell them on to those who are interested and would like a copy. As long as you're a part of a public sector organisation, or you're a university person or something or whatever, then I can invoice you later and send you the book. If you're a private individual, I'm afraid you'll have to pay me first and then I'll send you the book. But I can do it that way. Alternatively, it is sold via Amazon, although I suspect you might find that it's difficult to get a copy of them. But what I would say with Amazon is they vary the price enormously, so it's worth looking out sometimes. My publisher sells this book for about £40 a copy. I think that's too much. I sell it for about 25. Sometimes Amazon is cheaper, sometimes Amazon is more expensive. It's just a question of shopping around, as they say. Now, yes, I know I produced this book in 2010. It was written in the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, so it was very current when I wrote it. The principles and concepts in it hold true today. Some of the things to do with the law have changed, and I know that. And in my ideal world, I would update that. But if anybody wants to talk to me about what's changed, then I'm quite happy to run through the key changes in legislation since this book was published. Other than that, I would argue it's a good groundwork, and people have said, people in the profession and people who are auditors and people who are investigators have said they've enjoyed the honesty of, because I cover the mistakes that people make and that I've made. One of the ways you learn in life is by the mistakes. And there are investigations that went horribly wrong because of a terrible mistake, but you don't make that mistake again. So it teaches you how to get it right without making the mistakes I made in my youth. Well, not all of them, anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And we'll make sure that underneath the titles, there is a link to your website so viewers can go and buy it from you. It sounds like from you, it's the best deal. I've got a copy of this book.
By and large, it's definitely the best deal.
Yeah. And his other books, which are behind him. And we'll probably come to those in a few vodcasts time. But otherwise, thank you very much, Dr. Peter Tickner. And hopefully viewers will buy your book. Thank you.
I live in hope.